Do sports mega events like the Summer Olympic Games benefit the host city economically? All right, that clearly establishes the topic. We're talking about the Olympic Games. We're talking about how it affects the host city economically. So we're not talking about other non-economic effects, right? It boils down to the dollars, right? And the answer is right there. It depends, but the prospects are less than rosy, which means the author is going to, they're not great, is what he's saying, which means the author is going to explain why it's not that great, an economic benefit to the host city when they conduct the Summer Olympic Games. All right, the trick, the important thing, therefore, his suggestion is converting several $billion in operating costs during the 17-day fiesta of the games into a basis for long-term economic returns. So, if they have to derive value from the Olympic Games economically, then they have to convert it into long-term economic returns. These days, the Olympic Games themselves generate a total revenue of $4 to $5 billion. So you get a lot of money from the Olympic Games during those 17 days. But the lion's share of this goes to the International Olympics Committee, the National Olympic Committee, and the International Sports Federation. So all of these guys are taking the money away from the city during those 17 days. Any economic benefit would have to flow from the value of the games as an advertisement for the city. So this is one option. The new transportation and communication infrastructure. So the infrastructure is the second possibility. Or the ongoing use of the new facilities. So the facilities is your third possibility. So he's saying that any economic benefit. So he's not saying that this will definitely benefit. If at all you get any benefit, it has to come from the advertisement, the infrastructure, and the facilities, not from the 17 days. All right, so we're probably going to talk about these three, right? Because the first sentence of the next para says, evidence suggests that the advertising effect is far from certain. So it's ruling that out. Advertising effect is not working. You're not going to get a lot from it. The infrastructure benefit depends on the initial condition of the city and the effectiveness of the planning. So again, there are problems there, right? If your city was not great to begin with, and if your planning is not bad, then you don't get the infrastructure benefit. The facilities benefit is dubious at best. So he's questioned all three and is pointing out that none of the three are certain. For buildings such as velodromes and natatoriums, what are velodromes and natatoriums? Do you know what they are? Don't worry about it. Let's finish reading the sentence. And problematic for 100,000 seat Olympic stadiums. So he's saying that the possibility of getting facilities benefits is dubious or doubtful for buildings such as velodromes. If you don't know what velodromes are, don't panic, because the whole point could be that you don't know it, right? You don't even know what this facility is, how are you going to use it? And problematic for 100,000 seat Olympic stadiums, he's talking clearly about the size of the stadium. The latter, which is the 100,000 seat Olympic stadium, requires a conversion plan for future use. How are we going to use it later? The former are usually doomed to near vacancy, and by former he is referring to our velodromes, right? So they're doomed to near vacancy, because if people don't know what they are and if it's not a popular sport, then why would they be using it? Hosting the summer games generally requires 30 plus sports venues. So you're going to have 30 such venues and dozens of training centers. Today, the bird's nest in Beijing sits virtually empty, while the Olympic Stadium in Sydney costs some $30 million a year to operate. So clearly he's trying to show that either the sports are not popular and no one goes to the facilities afterwards. So they're not popular, right? Or they are huge and cost a lot, like the Olympic Stadium in Sydney. Those seems to be the central theme around facilities that he's talking about in this passage, in this paragraph. All right, let's move on. Part of the problem is that Olympics planning takes place in a frenzied and time-pressured atmosphere of intense competition with other prospective host cities. Frenzied is like in a hurry, you're rushing around, you're not doing your due diligence, you're not sitting and thinking things out, you're just doing everything haphazard, right? Not optimal conditions for contemplating the future shape of an urban landscape. So this is not ideal. You're competing with another guy. Like Beijing is thinking Sydney is going to put in an application, and I have to outperform them. I have to show better than them. So what things can we add? And then I'm trying to do it in a time frame, right? So it's not an ideal condition. Another part of the problem is that urban land is generally scarce and growing scarcer. So land is obviously a shortage that we know in everywhere. The new facilities often stand for decades or longer. Even if they have future use, which is doubtful, if they have a future use, even if they do that, are they the best use of precious urban real estate? So you have so many things that you can build in a city, and space in a city is so scarce. Do you really want to invest that in an Olympic stadium? Further, cities must consider the human cost. Residential areas are often raised and citizens are relocated without adequate preparation or compensation. Yes, life is made more hectic and congested because of all the extra people there or whatever, right? Just the construction and everything, right? There are, after all, other productive uses that can be made of vanishing fiscal resources. So your money can be put to better uses, but you have to consider the human cost. So the whole point of the last couple of paragraphs is to point out the reasons that they don't work, right? Reasons for, I'm just going to say failure, but basically reasons that host cities are not able to get money out of the Olympic stadiums, and a lot of it has to do with the urban landscape and the people living there. All right, so if I was looking at this passage in terms of a test environment, it's an easy to read passage. It's not difficult to understand, especially because it's on a topic that is relatable. We all know about the Olympic Games. We can all understand the reality of city planning and how it causes congestion and relocation and all of that. Now, one thing I would probably do is, just based on the fact that this is 4 paragraphs long and is followed by 3 questions. In terms of time management, I would put it on the back burner just by looking at the passage and then revisit it later. There are several reasons for you to choose to do a passage or not do a passage. When we are discussing a passage and looking at the difficulty of the questions, it is very easy to retrospectively say, this is not a passage that I would do in a CAT environment, which is valid, which is important for you to know. But as a student, how do you figure out whether a passage is something that you should do in the moment? One is the length of the passage versus kind of like a cost benefit analysis. How much time am I spending on the passage to read and understand it versus how many questions can I get out of it? That's one factor. Another factor is you should be able to determine how well you're going to be able to read the passage based on the first few sentences of the passage. And that takes a lot of practice to get there. You need to practice RC diligently, because if you're not a regular reader, if you're not practicing reading comprehension, every passage will feel difficult. And if every passage feels difficult, then you're not going to be able to decide after reading the first few sentences whether you're looking at an easy to read or a difficult to read passage, right? So that's a factor. Practice enough so that after reading the first few sentences of a passage, you're able to decide the language or the point that the author is trying to make in the passage. None of this is difficult for me to process. I can go ahead and read this passage comfortably, because usually the tone and the language stays the same consistently across the passage. So if you can figure out based on the first paragraph, you should be able to determine the rest. And then the third point of difficulty that could arise is in the questions themselves. The questions could be hard even though the passage was easy to read. And that is when you have to take the call to do the questions selectively. You read a question, you look through the options, you set yourself a time limit, and then you're saying that, okay, I've invested this amount of time, I cannot make head or tails out of this question. You should be willing to take the call to skip the question and move on. Or on reading the question, you're not sure which part of the passage it references to, you move on. You finish reading the passage and you realize, I kind of get what he's saying in parts of it, but I don't get the overall theme. Then you skip questions such as main idea and central theme and questions like that. So there are 3 different levels in which you can take a call on whether to do the passage now, do it later, or simply skip it. And that is when you're looking at the length of the passage versus the questions. When you start reading the passage and you're determining the difficulty of the reading and the processing of the information. And then when you're looking at the questions and then you're looking at how difficult the question is. I don't find this passage difficult to read, but in a test environment for this length, I would probably say I'm going to do it later. I won't skip the passage, but I'll say I'll do it later simply because it's 4 paragraphs for 3 questions. All right, let's look at the questions. The central point in the first paragraph is that economic benefits of the Olympic Games. First paragraph is basically saying cities don't get economic benefits. They make $4 to $5 billion in 17 days, but then the lion's share goes to the committees. If at all cities get any benefits, it has to come from those three factors: advertisement, infrastructure, and later use of facilities. Alright, now let's look at our answer options. Are shared equally among the three organizing committees? Well, the organizing committees get the money, but are they shared equally? There's no mention of equally in the passage, so I'm going to eliminate that. Accrue mostly through revenue from advertisements and ticket sales. He is saying that you get economic benefits for the city from the advertisement value to the city. It doesn't mention ticket sales anywhere in the passage. And the question is about economic benefits to the Olympic Games. This option doesn't talk specifically about city or who is getting these benefits. So I'm going to eliminate this option as well. Accrue to host cities, if at all, only in the long term. Okay, that makes sense. If at all they get revenue, it happens in the long term and from the later use of the infrastructure and the facilities, right? So we'll hold on to this option. Are usually eroded by expenditure. We've not talked about expenditure incurred by the host city, not in the first paragraph. In the tail end of the passage, in the last sentence, he's saying, if you're going to be spending money, why not spend it on other reasons? But in the first paragraph, which is what the question is talking about, there is no mention of expenditure. And we're going to go ahead and eliminate D as well. And that pretty much leaves us with C as the answer. If at all they get any benefits, it's only in the long term from those three factors that's mentioned in the first para. Sports facilities built for the Olympics are not fully utilized after the games are over because. Alright, we're talking about facilities. And you remember facilities was the core discussion aspect in the second paragraph after they ruled out infrastructure and advertising in the first 1-2 sentences. And we identified two reasons and we put it down in the notes. One of them is that they are not popular and people do not know what velodromes are and whatever, so they are not used frequently. Right, they're doomed for near vacancy is what the passage says. And then the second factor that we talked about was that they're huge and then they cost a lot, which was the $30 million example given for the Olympic Stadium in Sydney. Right, let's look at your options. Their scale and cost of operating them are large. Yes, that's the Sydney example. That is a reason that is given. So we'll hold on to this. Their location away from the city center usually limits easy access. We've not talked about the location or about the accessibility. Its popularity, costs. Those are the two factors. So I'm going to rule this out. The authorities do not adapt them to local conditions. We've not talked about adapting them. They become outdated, having been built with little planning and under time pressure. They have mentioned that they are built with little planning and under time pressure. This part of it is mentioned in the third paragraph. But is it outdated? That's not necessarily something that he's saying. The outdated part is questionable. Right, so that's why I'm going to rule out D, which means your answer is A. The scale and cost of operating them are large, which is the point that we're trying to make in the second paragraph when quoting the Sydney example and the Beijing examples. Moving on to the third question. The author feels that the games place a burden on the host city for all of the following reasons except that. So, burden on the host city, we talked about all of this in the third and the fourth paragraphs. If you remember, we talked about the human cost. We talked about the time pressure, the lack of space, and how urban land is generally scarce and growing scarcer. I'm looking down because I have the passage printed for me, right? And then it talks about residential areas being raised and citizens relocated. Those are the sentences in the last paragraph, and then a couple of sentences towards the end of the third paragraph. That's where you should be looking at for the answers. Again, it's an except question. Find 3 that are true and eliminate them. Whatever you're left with is the answer. Right? They divert scarce urban land from more productive uses. Absolutely mentioned in the passage. They're talking about scarcity. They involve the demolition of residential structures to accommodate sports facilities and infrastructure. Yes, that's in the fourth paragraph. The finances used to fund the games could be better used for other purposes. This is in the last sentence of the passage. when he says there are, after all, other productive uses that can be made of vanishing fiscal resources. So that's the last sentence of the passage. So all of these three are definitely true. The influx of visitors during the games places a huge strain on the urban infrastructure. We have not talked about visitors in the last paragraph. In fact, we have not talked about visitors anywhere in the passage other than to mention that you could use advertising to attract visitors. But whether that works, whether the visitors come, etc., etc., has not been discussed anywhere in the passage, which means your answer has to be D.